Section 10 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Richard Shipp. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 5, Over the Gobi Desert, Part 2. On entering a Chinese city, we always made it a rule to run rapidly through until we came to an inn, and then lock up our wheels before the crowd could collect. Urumtsi, however, was too large and intricate for such a manoeuvre. We were obliged to dismount in the principal thoroughfare. The excited throng pressed in upon us. Among them was a Chinaman who could talk a little Russian, and who undertook to direct us to a comfortable inn at the far end of the city. This street parade gathered to the inn-yard an overwhelming mob, and announced to the whole community that the foreign horses had come. It had been posted, we were told, a month before, that 2 people of the New World were coming through on strange iron horses, and everyone was requested not to molest them. By this, public curiosity was raised to the highest pitch. When we returned from supper at a neighbouring restaurant, we were treated to a novel scene. The doors and windows of our apartments had been blocked with boxes, bales of cotton, and huge cartwheels to keep out the irrepressible throng. Our host was agitated to tears. He came out wringing his hands and urging upon us that any attempt on our part to enter would cause a rush that would break his house down. We listened to his entreaties on the condition that we should be allowed to mount to the roof with a ladder to get away from the annoying curiosity of the crowd. There we sat through the evening twilight, while the crowd below, somewhat balked but not discouraged, stood taking in every move. Nightfall and a drizzling rain came at last to our relief. The next morning a squad of soldiers was dispatched to raise the siege, and at the same time presents began to arrive from the various officials, from the Song Tu, or Viceroy, down to the superintendent of the local prisons. The matter of how much to accept of a Chinese present, and how much to pay for it, in the way of a tip to the bearer, is one of the finest points of that finest of fine arts, Chinese etiquette. And yet in the midst of such an abundance and variety we were hopelessly at sea. Fruits and teas were brought, together with meats and chickens, and even a live sheep. Our Chinese visiting cards, with the Chinese the great insignia of rank, were now returned for those sent with the presents, and the hour appointed for the exhibition of our bicycles as requested. Long before the time, the streets and housetops leading from the inn to the Viceroy's palace at the far end of the city began to fill with people, and soldiers were detailed at our request to make an opening for us to ride through abreast. This, however, did not prevent the crowd from pushing us against each other, or sticking sticks in the wheels, or throwing their hats and shoes in front of us as we rode by. When in sight of the Viceroy's palace, they closed in on us entirely. It was the worst jam we had ever been in. By no possibility could we mount our machines, although the mob was growing more and more impatient. They kept shouting for us to ride, but would give us no room. Those on the outside pushed the inner ones against us. With the greatest difficulty could we preserve our equilibrium, and prevent the wheels from being crushed as we surged along toward the palace gate, while all the time our Russian interpreter, Mafu, on horseback in front, continued to shout and gesticulate in the wildest manner above their heads. 20 soldiers had been stationed at the palace gate to keep back the mob with cudgels. When we reached them, they pulled us and our wheels quickly through into the enclosure, and then tried to stem the tide by belabouring the heads and shoulders in reach, including those of our unfortunate interpreter Mafu. But it was no use. Everything was swept away before this surging wave of humanity. The Viceroy himself, who now came out to receive us, was powerless. All he could do was to request them to make room around the palace courtyard for the coming exhibition. Thousands of thumbs were uplifted that afternoon in praise of the wonderful tui ta che, or two-wheeled carts, as they witnessed our modest attempt at trick riding and special manoeuvring. After refreshments in the palace, to which we were invited by the Viceroy, we were counselled to leave by a rear door and return by a roundabout way to the inn, leaving the mob to wait till dark for our exit from the front. The restaurant or tea house in China takes the place of the Western clubroom. All the current news and gossip is here circulated and discussed over their eating or gambling. One of their games of chance, which we have frequently noticed, seems to consist in throwing their fingers at one another and shouting at the top of their voices. It is really a matching of numbers, for which the Chinamen make signs on their fingers, up to the numeral 10. Our entry into a crowded dungan, or native Mohammedan restaurant, the next morning was the signal for exciting accounts of the events of the previous day. We were immediately invited to take tea with this one, a morning dish of tung posas, or nut and sugar dumplings, with another, while a third came over with his can of sojoi, or Chinese gin, with an invitation to join him. The Chinese of all nations seem to live in order to eat, and from this race of epicures has developed a nation of excellent cooks. Our fare in China, outside the Gobi district, was far better than in Turkey or Persia, and for this reason we were better able to endure the increased hardships. A plate of sliced meat stewed with vegetables and served with a piquant sauce, sliced radishes, and onions with vinegar, 2 loaves of Chinese momo, or steamed bread, and a pot of tea would usually cost us about 3 1/4 cents apiece. Everything in China is sliced, so that it can be eaten with the chopsticks. These we at length learned to manipulate with sufficient dexterity to pick up a dove's egg, the highest attainment in the chopstick art. The Chinese have rather a sour than a sweet tooth. Sugar is rarely used in anything, and never in tea. The steeped tea flowers, which the higher classes use, are really more tasty without it. In many of the smaller towns, our visits to the restaurant would sometimes result in considerable damage to its keepers, for the crowd would swarm in after us, knocking over the tables, stools, and crockery as they went, and collect in a circle around us to watch the "foreigners" eat, and to add their opium and tobacco smoke to the suffocating atmosphere. A visit to the local mint in Urumtsi revealed to us the primitive method of making the chen, or money discs, before mentioned. Each is moulded instead of cut and stamped as in the West. By its superintendent we were invited to a special breakfast on the morning of our departure. The Chinese are the only people in the Orient, and so far as we know, in the European and Asiatic continents, who resemble the Americans in their love for a good substantial morning meal. This was much better adapted to our purpose than the Russian custom, which compelled us to do the greater part of our day's work on merely bread and weak tea. From Urumtsi, we had decided to take the northern route to Hami via Guchen and Barkul, in order to avoid as much as possible the sands of the Tarim Basin on the southern slope of the Tian Shan Mountains. 2 guards were commissioned by the Viceroy to take us in charge and hand us over to the next relay station. Papers were given them to be signed by the succeeding authorities on our safe arrival. This plan had been adopted by every chief mandarin along the route, in order not only to follow out the request of the London minister as written on the passport, but principally to do us honour in return for the favour of a bicycle exhibition. But many times we would leave our discomfited guards to return with unsigned papers. Had we been travelling in the ordinary way, not only these favours might not have been shown us, but our project entirely defeated by local obstructions, as was the case with many who attempted the same journey by caravan. To the goodwill of the mandarins, as well as the people, an indispensable concomitant of a journey through China, our bicycles were, after all, our best passports. They everywhere overcame the antipathy for the foreigner and made us cordially welcome. The costumes of our soldiers were strikingly picturesque. Over the front and back of the scarlet waistcoats were worked in black silk letters their military credentials. Over their full baggy trousers were drawn their riding overalls, which cover only the front and sides of the legs, the back being cut out just above the cloth top of their Chinese boots. Instead of a cap, they wear a piece of printed cloth wrapped tightly around the head, like the American washerwomen. Their well-cushioned saddles did not save them from the constant jolting to which our high speed subjected them. At every stopping place they would hold forth at length to the curious crowd about their roadside experiences. It was amusing to hear their graphic descriptions of the mysterious ding by which they referred to the ring of the cyclometer at every mile. But the phrase "Quay Tai Hen," very fast, which concluded almost every sentence, showed what feature impressed them most. Then, too, they disliked very much to travel in the heat of the day, for all summer travelling in China is done at night. They would wake us up many hours before daylight to make a start, despite our previous request to be left alone. Our week's run to Barkul was made with a good natural road and favouring conditions, at the rate of 53 miles per day, 8 miles more than our general average across the empire. From Kuljar to the Great Wall, where our cyclometer broke, we took accurate measurements of the distances. In this way we soon discovered that the length of a Chinese li was even more changeable than the value of the tael. According to time and place, from 185 to 250 were variously reckoned to a degree, while even a difference in direction would very often make a considerable difference in the distance. It is needless to say that, at this rate, the guards did not stay with us. Official courtesy was now confined to dispatches sent in advance. Through this exceptionally wild district were encountered several herds of antelope and wild asses, which the natives were hunting with their long, heavy, fork-wresting rifles. Through the exceptional tameness of the jackrabbits along the road, we were sometimes enabled to procure with a revolver the luxury of a meat supper. At Barkul, Tartar, the first evidence of English influence began to appear in the place of the fading Russian, although the traces of Russian manufacture were by no means wanting far beyond the Great Wall. English pulverized sugar now began to take the place of Russian lump. India rubber, instead of the Russianized French élastique, was a native name for our rubber tires. English letters, too, could be recognized on the second-hand paper and bagging appropriated to the natives' use, and even the gilded buttons worn by the soldiers bore the stamp of treble gilt. From here the road to Halmi turns abruptly south, and by a pass of over 9,000 feet crosses the declining spurs of the Tian Shan Mountains, which stand like a barrier between the two great historic highways, deflecting the westward waves of migration, some to Kashgaria and others to Zungaria. On the southern slope of the pass we met with many large caravans of donkeys, dragging down pine logs to serve as poles in the proposed extension of the telegraph line from Suchow to Urumtsi. In June of this year, the following item appeared in the newspapers. Within a few months, Peking will be united by wire with St. Petersburg, and in consequence with the telegraph system of the entire civilized world. According to the latest issue of the Turkestan Gazette, the telegraph line from Peking has been brought as far west as the city of Kashgar. The European end of the line is Osh, and a small stretch of about 140 miles now alone breaks the direct telegraph communication from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Halmi is one of those cities which may be regarded as indispensable. At the edge of the Great Gobi and the converging point of the Nanlu and Peilu, that is, the southern and northern routes to the Western world, this oasis is a necessary resting place. During our stop of 2 days, to make necessary repairs and recuperate our strength for the hardships of the desert, the usual calls were exchanged with the leading officials. In the matter of social politeness, the Chinese, especially the literati, have reason to look down upon the barbarians of the West. Politeness has been likened generally to an air cushion. There is nothing in it, but it eases the jolts wonderfully. As a mere ritual of technicalities, it has perhaps reached its highest point in China. The multitude of honorific titles, so bewildering and even maddening to the Occidental, are here used simply to keep in view the fixed relations of graduated superiority. When wishing to be exceptionally courteous to the foreigners, the more experienced mandarins would lay their doubled fists in the palms of our hands instead of raising them in front of their foreheads, with the usual salutation Homao. In shaking hands with a Chinaman, we thus very often had our hands full. After the exchange of visiting cards, as an indication that their visits would be welcome, they would come on foot, in carts or palanquins according to their rank, and always attended by a larger or smaller retinue. Our return visits would always be made by request, on the wheels, either alone or with our interpreter, if we could find one, for our Chinese was as yet painfully defective. Russian had served us in good stead, though not always directly. In a conversation with the Tutai of Skicho, for instance, our Russian had to be translated into Turkey and thence interpreted in Chinese. The more intelligent of these conversations were about our own and other countries of the world, especially England and Russia, who, it was rumoured, had gone to war on the Afghanistan border. But the most of them generally consisted of a series of trivial interrogations, beginning usually with, "How old are you?" Owing to our beards, which were now full grown, and which had gained for us the frequent title of Ye Ren, or wild men, the guesses were far above the mark. One was even as high as 60 years, for the reason, as was stated, that no Chinaman could raise such a beard before that age. We were frequently surprised at their persistence in calling us brothers when there was no apparent reason for it, and were finally told that we must be because we were both named Mr. on our passports. It was almost dusk on the evening of August 10 when we drew up to the hamlet of Shang Lu Shui at the end of the Hami oasis. The great Gobi, in its awful loneliness, stretched out before us like a vast ocean of endless space. The growing darkness threw its mantle on the scene, and left imagination to picture for us the nightmare of our boyhood days. We seemed, as it were, to be standing at the end of the world, looking out into the realm of nowhere. Foreboding thoughts disturbed our repose as we contemplated the 400 miles of this barren stretch to the Great Wall of China. With an early morning start, however, we struck out at once over the 85 miles of the Taklamakan sands. This was the worst we could have, for beyond the caravan station of Kushi we would strike the projecting limits of Mongolian Kansu. This narrow tract, now lying to our left between Hami and the Nanshan Mountains, is characterized by considerable diversity in its surface, soil, and climate. Traversed by several copious streams from the Nanshan Mountains, and the moisture-laden currents from the Bay of Bengal and the Brahmaputra Valley, its desert stretches are not the dismal solitudes of the Tarim Basin or the black and red sands of Central Asia. Water is found almost everywhere near the surface, and springs bubble up in the hollows, often encircled by exterior oases. Everywhere the ground is traversable by horses and carts. This comparatively fertile tract, cutting the Gobi into two great sections, has been, ever since its conquest 2,000 years ago, of vast importance to China, being the only feasible avenue of communication with the western provinces and the more important link in the only great highway across the empire. A regular line of caravan stations is maintained by the constant traffic both in winter and summer. But we were now on a bit of the genuine Gobi, that is, sandy desert, of the Mongolian or Shamo of the Chinese. Everywhere was the same interminable picture of vast undulating plains of shifting reddish sands, interspersed with quartz pebbles, agates and carnelians, and relieved here and there by patches of wiry shrubs, used as fuel at the desert stations, or lines of hillocks succeeding each other like waves on the surface of the shoreless deep. The wind, even more than the natural barrenness of the soil, prevents the growth of any vegetation except low, pliant herbage. Withered plants are uprooted and scattered by the gale-like patches of foam on the stormy sea. These terrible winds, which of course were against us, with the frequently heavy cart tracks, would make it quite impossible to ride. The monotony of many weary hours of plodding was relieved only by the bones of some abandoned beast of burden, or the occasional train of Chinese carts, or rather two-wheeled vans, loaded with merchandise and drawn by 5 to 6 horses or mules. For miles away they would see us coming, and crane their necks in a wondering gaze as we approached. The mulish leaders with distended ears would view our strange-looking vehicles with suspicion, and then lurch far out in their 20-foot traces, pulling the heavily loaded vehicles from the deep-rutted track. but the drivers were too busy with their eyes to notice any little divergence of this kind. Dumb with astonishment, they continued to watch us till we disappeared again toward the opposite horizon. Farther on, we would meet a party of Chinese emigrants or exiles on their way to the fertile regions that skirt the northern and southern slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains. By these people, even the distant valley of the Li is being largely populated. Being on foot, with their extraordinary loads balanced on flexible shoulder poles, these poor fellows could make only one station, or from 12 to 20 miles a day. In the presence of their patience and endurance, we were ashamed to think of such a thing as hardship. The station houses on the desert were nothing more than a collection of mud huts near a surface well of strongly brackish water. Here, most of the caravans would put up during the day and travel at night. There was no such thing as a restaurant. Each one by turn must do his own cooking in the inn kitchen, open to all. We, of course, were expected to carry our own provisions and do our own culinary work like any other respectable travellers. This we had frequently done before where restaurants were not to be found. Many a time we would enter an inn with our arms filled with provisions purchased at the neighbouring bazaars, take possession of the oven and cooking utensils, and proceed to get up an American meal, while all the time 100 eyes or more would be staring at us in blank amazement. But here on the desert we could buy nothing but very coarse flour. When asked if they had an egg or a piece of vegetable, they would say, "Ma yu," there is none, in a tone of rebuke, as much to say, "My conscience, man, what do you expect on the Gobi?" We would have to be content with our own tea made in the iron pot, fitting in the top of the mud oven, and a kind of sweetened bread made up with our supply of sugar brought from Hami. This we nicknamed our Gobi cake, although it did taste rather strongly of brackish water and the garlic of previous contents of the one common cooking pot. We would usually take a large supply for road use on the following day, or, as sometimes proved, for the midnight meal of the half-starved inn dog. The interim between the evening meal and bedtime was always employed in writing notes by the feeble flickering light of a primitive taper lamp, which was the best we had throughout the Chinese journey. A description of travelling in China would by no means be complete without some mention of the vermin which infest not only inns and houses, but the persons of nearly all the lower classes. Lice and fleas seem to be the sine qua non of Chinese life, and in fact the itching with some seems to furnish the only occasion for exercise. We have seen even shopkeepers before their doors on a sunny afternoon, amusing themselves by picking these insidious creatures from their inner garments. They are one of the necessary evils, it seems, and no secret is made of it. The sleeping kangs of the Chinese inns, which are made of beaten earth and heated in winter like an oven, harbour these pests the year round, not to mention the filthy coverlets and greasy pillows that were sometimes offered us. Had we not had our own sleeping bags and used the camera, provision bag and coats for pillows, our life would have been intolerable. As it was, there was but little rest for the weary. The longest station on the desert was 31 miles. This was the only time that we suffered at all with thirst. In addition to the high mean elevation of the Gobi, about 4,000 feet, we had cloudy weather for a considerable portion of the journey, and in the Kansu district even a heavy thunder shower. These occasional summer rains form, here and there, temporary meres and lakes, which are soon evaporated, leaving nothing behind except a saline efflorescence. Elsewhere the ground is furrowed by sudden torrents tearing down the slopes of the occasional hills or mountains. These dried-up riverbeds furnished the only continuously hard surfaces we found on the Gobi, although even here we were sometimes brought up with a round turn in a chuck hole, with the sound flying above our heads. Our aneroid barometer registered approximately 6,500 feet when we reached at dusk the summit of the highest range of hills we encountered on the desert journey. But instead of the station hut we expected to find, we were confronted by an old Mongolian monastery. These institutions, we had found, were generally situated, as this one, at the top of some difficult mountain pass, or at the mouth of some cavernous gorge, where the pious intercessors might, to the best advantage, strive to appease the wrathful forces of nature. In this line of duty the Lama was no doubt engaged when we walked into his feebly lighted room, But, like all Orientals, he would let nothing interfere with the performance of his religious duties. With his gaze centered upon one spot, his fingers flew over the string of beads in his lap, and his tongue over the stereotyped prayers, with a rapidity that made our heads swim. We stood unnoticed till the end, when we were at once invited to a cup of tea and directed to our destination, 5 li beyond. Toward this we plodded through the growing darkness and rapidly cooling atmosphere, for in its extremes of temperature the Gobi is at once both Siberian and Indian, and that, too, within the short period of a few hours. Some of the mornings of what proved to be very hot days were cold enough to make our extremities fairly tingle. End of section 10.